Thank you all for coming. It's really exciting to be here at Google. I began writing this book about now 7 years ago. I think it's about 7 years ago. In the book it says 5 because when I finished it, it had been 5, but then it's been 2 years since I turned it in and went through the whole publishing process. As an English lecturer, I thought I would start with this novel that I really love and which I'm sure some of you have read. It's called Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And one of the things that's very interesting about it is that it takes place on a single day, like Joyce's Ulysses, in the 1920s, when a woman is walking around the city of London and looking back on her life. She's remembering things in her life. And at the same time, the novel is moving forward in time. The original title for the novel was The Hours. And Woolf is actually registering the tolling of bells at different times of the day as we move through the novel. And I really like this idea of the double timeline, because I think when you get a bit older, as I am in my life, you do tend to look back and think about how you got here and what you didn't know when you were much younger. So I thought that might be a good way to introduce this talk. When we think about our lives, are they stories? Can we ever predict what's going to happen? There are things that we might want to happen or expect to happen, and certainly things that society tells us should happen. But in fact, there's much that we have very little control over, and we don't really know what's going to happen. So the epigraph that I take from my book is from the poet Robert Lowell, an American poet, and it is, "Why not say what happened?" All right, so this will all become clear, but I wanted to begin with some slides that I put together for a course in memoir that I taught at Barnard College last fall, when we were talking a little bit at the end of our class about my book. So just the question, what lies ahead for this child myself, on an Easter Sunday in Philadelphia long ago? Now, I guess I go this way. And here I am with my first communion, a little Catholic girl, an Irish Catholic girl, being raised by a very Irish Catholic family. My 4 grandparents emigrated from Ireland in the late 1920s, and my parents were born in Philadelphia. And we grew up very close to my grandparents and in this kind of saturated Irish Catholic life. The photograph on the right is myself the summer right after I graduated from high school. So I'm about to go to college, and I think that I look a little bit sad in this photograph, and I'll explain why later. All right, so I am 27, it's September, and it's Labor Day weekend, and I'm hiking in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and I'm 6 months pregnant with my first child. And it's a really beautiful day, and it seems like a great day. Everything looks good. We got a little further along this trail, and the sky clouded over, and lightning started flashing, and it started hailing. And I was suddenly really afraid that I was doing something incredibly stupid, that I had put my baby at risk by taking this hike. And I suddenly realized that it had been a stupid thing to do. Of course, everything was fine, and we turned around and got very wet and came back home. All right, so I'm going to stop there for a moment and just read a couple of paragraphs from the beginning of the book. Going through a box of old photographs recently, I came upon one taken long ago at a baby shower in a friend's New York apartment. I'm seated at the center of the photograph wearing a gray winter dress, my 8-month pregnancy mostly hidden behind the gift box on my lap. I'm 27. A small stuffed bear sits at my feet beside its crumpled wrapping paper. My husband is to my left, looking relaxed, holding a beer, and several of our college friends are in the photo as well, drinking, eating, watching me open their presents. I'm holding up another gift I've just unwrapped, a newborn's onesie in white, sprinkled with tiny bears outlined in pink and blue. Looking at this young woman many years later, I feel a rush of fear and pity for her, unprepared as she is for what will unfold a few weeks later when her baby dies. Another photograph sits on the desk where I write. It was taken 13 years later after a divorce and remarriage on a visit to Arizona in the springtime. In the background, out of focus, is a blur of mountain, aspen trees, and blue sky. In the foreground, in close-up, I'm hugging my rosy-cheeked 9-month-old son, his broad forehead and dark hair much like my own, his eyes lit up in a smile as his father snaps the picture. On a hike that day, I had let the baby down from his carrier to test his legs and watched him grasp the big round boulders along the side of the trail. The photograph was taken a moment later, just as I've lifted him up, and our faces reflect the pleasure of being outdoors in the sunshine. I keep this photograph on my desk because it radiates happiness and comfort. It reminds me of what I've been given and how love for my husband and son continues to anchor and sustain me. This book is about the difficult path I traveled between the moments captured in these two photographs. After the death of my infant daughter, I fell into a depression so severe and unrelenting that I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital where I nearly succeeded in taking my own life. Since then, I have never taken the fact of my existence for granted. Instead of living as I do now, teaching, writing, spending time with friends and family, taking pleasure in watching my son grow up, I might be nothing more than a fading memory in the minds of those who knew me as a woman who died young, in sad and desperate circumstances. I'm aware as I remember that long ago day of gift giving, that my own life has been another kind of gift, a second chance. Even so, the depression that emerged so clearly at that time has never entirely left me. It is the trace of bad luck that lingers amid so much good fortune that has come to me since. Okay, so I can stop there, I think. Or shall I'll just say a little bit more about the book before Caroline comes up. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so the book, I decided to go back and look at my past. This is now 3 decades later, and to sort of put that time of nearly losing my life to this illness that I didn't know I had into some kind of framework where I could really try and figure it out, because I have had depression ever since then. And I realized looking back at my past that I also had it in high school. And when I look at that photograph of myself when I was 17 or 18, I can kind of see it there in my eyes. And I also looked at, my own history. I got my hospital record from the time, really long time ago, the entire record of having ECT and the whole treatment at the hospital for 3 months. And I also looked at the history of the treatment of mental illness, especially of depressive illness, from, say, the 19th century forward. So I tried to put my own story in this much longer, again, looking backward in time and looking at my own life moving forward. And that was the sort of idea that I had in creating the book as I did.
So thank you for your lovely opening.
Good.
Feeling this is going to be a very, very honest and very poignant talk as it already has been. My first question is about the word of a gift.
Yes.
So when you're sitting there with your first pregnancy, and you later on you talk about viewing your life now as a gift and as a second chance, or in Mary's words in the book. To what degree did that sensation inspire you to write the book, and maybe allow other people to feel that they too can have a second chance?
It did inspire me to write the book. And this really is a photograph that I keep on my desk. And I really love it. My son just turned 23 about 2-3 days ago. And he's here in Ireland with us. The idea that I almost lost my life. I came so close to losing my life because I actually cut my throat in a psychiatric hospital, and hence the scar, the name of the book. And when I began, and as you can probably imagine, this was not something I ever wanted to dwell on. As I moved away from that time, once I was kind of recovering and getting out of the hospital and needing to rebuild my life and dealing with this diagnosis and dealing with therapy and dealing with medication and kind of learning how to keep moving forward, having been so devastated, I didn't want to look at that, and I was very, very ashamed of having made a suicide attempt. And I never wanted anyone to know about it, which is, of course, why I never wrote this book before now. So I kind of was trying to hide my stigmatized identity as a person who had had a suicide attempt, who had been suicidal, had been institutionalized. This was all stuff like, nobody can know this because I'm now moving forward and going to graduate school and becoming a teacher, and I don't want any of my students or colleagues to know any of this. So only my really closest friends know about it, and I'm just always like putting it behind me. So as time went on, and I was very curious about, and I've been reading all my life ever since this happened, about mental illness and about treatment, and because it really is quite a mystery what's going on in the brain when these illnesses strike people, part of trying to deal with it has always been trying to learn and understand as much as I can about it. But when I looked at my life and I looked at my son and I thought, and I look at the scar, which I see every morning when I brush my teeth, this is really crazy that this almost happened. You know, I started thinking, this is an outrage. I was quite angry about it when I started to really think about it. Like, I've been dealing with the memory which is in the scar, which is visible to me anyway. And I kind of thought, okay, it's time to go back and look at that and look at what happened and really try to understand what happened back then. And because my son has been such a gift in my life, I thought also with a kind of horror that he would not exist if I did not exist, and that the two of us would not be here. So those were the ideas that I kind of was driven by when I finally decided to go back and look. And also there was a whole controversy about the medication that came up when a big study was done that came to the conclusion that antidepressants were mainly expensive placebos. You might remember this. And I thought, I've been taking these things for so long. Am I just taking these things that are like not doing anything? And I wanted to understand that. And I began the book by looking at the whole drug controversy and trying to get to the bottom of it. And then once I had done a lot of work on that, I decided that I couldn't publish a book about drugs because I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a biochemist, I'm not a pharmacist. The only authority that I have in this tale is my own experience, and that I would need to write about my experience. And of course, I had a lot of resistance to be feeling exposed in this way.
Of course.
And now I feel very exposed. So there you go.
Well, we've got a huge audience in front of us. I imagine that they're very grateful.
I'm used to it now.
To you for being exposed like that, because of what we can learn from that. I have a few questions regarding shame and stigma that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. I'm going to jump right into a tough one, if you don't mind, and quote a small bit from the book. So you say later on in the book, it's a very honest and very brave line. It's a very sad line just to prepare you. You say, "I want to turn away from the sight of that pathetic woman crouched in the shower. I want to disown her. I want her to stop embarrassing me." Mary's referring to herself, the time that she attempted suicide when she was in the hospital. Can you talk to us a little bit about resolving that feeling and getting to today and being able to have that quote made and in front of everyone?
I'm going to read a little bit more of that because just to give you a little bit more context, because it's really at the center of the book and of why I decided to write the book. And this has to do with getting access to my hospital record and being able for the first time to look at myself from the outside, to look at myself through the eyes of the doctors, and to see very, very clearly the horror of being in the condition that I was in, and to begin to learn how to have a lot of empathy for this very suffering person. So, and I talk about the scar as a different kind of personal, permanent record, like the hospital record. The scar is a record. And I say that I've often wished that I could undo this act, that I don't want this record on my body, and wish that all of this would not have happened, the death of my child, the illness, etc., if I could like unspool time and take it back again. So I just will read a little bit here. I've long felt that this act of violence against myself is too awful to talk about, and certainly too shameful to write about. Even now, I find it shocking. Looking back at these events in the hospital record provokes a complicated response. I am angry on behalf of the patient and her husband, who trusted the hospital to keep her safe. I'm appalled at the quick, desperate act of the patient, who needed so badly for her ordeal to be over. I want to turn away from the sight of that pathetic woman crouched in the shower stall. I want to disown her. I want her to stop embarrassing me. I want her to pull herself together. I also want to protect her. I want the staff to understand what's happening to her. I want to speak on her behalf. Yeah. So I kind of do speak on her behalf in this book, having separated myself now as this much older person who can now look back at this much younger person with tremendous empathy and a kind of effort to understand not only the condition that she was in, but the illness, this melancholic form of depression, which is a very, very severe form of depression, which I was diagnosed with at the time. In the 19th century, doctors would say that melancholics were the most suicidal of lunatics. Doctors in asylums, the most suicidal.
Wow.
Yeah. So just to give a little bit more to that question. Yeah. So tell me again the last part of your question there.
On how did you resolve going from viewing yourself with that shame and embarrassment, hiding it all when you went on to become a lecturer, to where you are today?
It really took a long time. From as long ago as 1994, I have wanted to write this book. It's a long time ago. In 1992, an American writer named William Styron, who was the author of Sophie's Choice and other very highly lauded American novels, wrote a short book called Darkness Visible, which is a quote from Milton's Paradise Lost. Darkness visible. Satan says when he falls to hell that hell is darkness visible. So Milton is taking this line from, Styron is taking this line from Milton, and he writes this kind of long essay about becoming suicidal at the age of 60 and having fallen into this horrendous depression. So in 1992 was the first time that really this illness gets, and the book became a bestseller, and it is really a classic of writing about depression. And so I went to hear Styron talk in 1994. 2 years later, I was a graduate student, and he was talking at a conference on American writers and suicide. There were people talking about Hemingway, about Plath, and so on. And I thought, I really want to write about my experience, because as a very young woman, and not a man, and not a famous writer, the effects of that on my life were really very, very damaging. At such a young age. And I thought, I can't write this book because I don't want anybody to know this about me. So it took a long time, and even when I finally turned to writing it around 2013 or so, I thought, I'm just writing this book for myself. I'm finally going to do this thing, and I'm not going to publish it. I don't want anybody to know this, but there's stuff that I need to figure out.
It's your own process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then as time went on, and I wrote a couple of chapters and really put a lot of work in, I thought, I'm going to try and publish it because it's so much work, and maybe I can get. So it took me time during the writing process to really get used to the tremendously uncomfortable feeling of exposure, of self-exposure, and at the same time a kind of feeling like, why should I feel ashamed of this?
Yeah.
This is not my fault. This is an illness that many, many people have, and that not enough people understand.
Yeah.
And that had people understood at the time what was happening to me, people in my family, my husband, myself, that would not have happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt that still people don't really understand
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah. That kind of brings me then to my next question. So we've come a long way since the 80s and the 90s regarding how our understanding of mental health and the importance of talking about what we're going through. But do you think that the remaining stigma will ever dissipate?
That's a really hard question. It depends in a way how old you are, whether you feel that these illnesses are stigmatizing or not. I've been talking to audiences, and usually it's the older people in the audience that will feel. There was a man at the launch in Hodges Figgis who was in tears when he spoke to me afterward, because he was an older man who had grown up in the west of Ireland where these things were treated with complete silence. And you would see the disintegration of people in your family and nothing would be said. And then there are, my son's generation, and my son says, nobody feels any stigma about this. My friends with diagnoses, they won't shut up about it. So I think on the one hand, there's much more openness among young people to sharing the truth about their lives. But at the same time, I think in the workplace especially, people do take a risk in letting anyone know, say, I have a depression diagnosis, or I have a bipolar diagnosis, or if you're lucky enough to have a job with a schizophrenia diagnosis, would you? I think there is definitely still a stigma there. And even publishing this book, I found when I was told by my editor, the woman who ended up buying the book, that she was having trouble getting her colleagues to go along with, they all had to agree on buying the book. Mm-hmm. And there's this feeling like, these kinds of books are such downers, I'm not sure we'll be able to sell this book. Mm-hmm. So I felt the stigma there very strongly, because I think this is a really well-written book. Yeah. It's very highly, I feel like it's an important book. Yeah. And it's sort of, because it looks back, because it looks forward, I thought, what's wrong with knowing the truth about these things, or speaking the truth about them? So I do think there is very much still a stigma.
Still there. Well, I guess the people who were afraid the book wouldn't sell were wrong, because we ran out of copies today for our
good. I'm very happy
audience.
To hear that.
So,
I had ECT when I was in the hospital. When I went into the hospital, I had only just begun to see a psychiatrist, much too late, in this very precipitous fall into a kind of depressive madness. And 2 weeks before I attempted suicide, I had started on a medication that they expected that would work if I were in the safety of the hospital, but it wasn't really working fast enough. So once I made the suicide attempt, they very quickly tapered the medication and began a course of ECT, which you probably know, this is electroconvulsive therapy or shock treatment. And one of the things about that is that there's tremendous stigma around that, and a kind of horror because of the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Yeah. How many people have seen this film? It came out in 1975. It won all 5 Academy Awards, with Jack Nicholson playing this. It's from a novel by Ken Kesey called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Anyway, you will never forget the scene of him having ECT without any anesthesia, without the muscle relaxants that were used even at the time, and being held down by 6 attendants, and his body kind of jumping and convulsing, and it's horrific. And you can see it on YouTube if you haven't seen it. So
if you want to.
When anybody hears, this is the other thing, you can't really ever tell people you've had ECT, because that's the first thing they think, and they think that you've undergone some kind of horrific torture. So I do write about the history of various treatments in the book, because the problem with mental illnesses has been all along that doctors are trying to treat illnesses that they don't understand. They don't understand the neurophysiological processes that are happening in the body and in the brain, so they don't know what they're aiming at in terms of treatment, and the treatments have been quite experimental. Mm-hmm. So they work on hints or, and that's how it's gone. So it's been this very kind of experimental process. Mm-hmm. There had been inklings that electricity could kind of have an enlivening effect on the brain. And so that began as long ago as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was published in the late 18th century, or maybe 1820 or 1818, something like that. So the first person to have ECT is a man who wanders into the train station in Rome in 1938. He doesn't know his name, and he is incoherent, and the police pick him up and take him to this psychiatric hospital, where it turns out that a man named Ugo Cerletti has been working for 2 years to try and come up with a process to induce convulsions, a brain seizure, through electricity. This has been done with a chemical induction process by someone else and has had some effects on people with psychosis. So he's been working on with dogs, and he's been working with pigs in Rome's slaughterhouse. Cerletti's colleague, Lucio Bini, built a small box that would transmit the current. The challenge was to find the proper variables of voltage and duration that were strong enough to cause a seizure and not so strong as to cause death. Once they determined that the gap between a seizure-inducing dose and a lethal dose of electricity was wide, they felt it would be safe to take their experiment to the next level. The police had just unwittingly delivered them their first human subject. On 11th April, they were ready to proceed. They put a gauze-covered rubber tube between the man's teeth and placed electrodes moistened with saline on his temples. Bini flicked the switch, and 80 volts of current ran for a quarter of a second. The man's body jumped, and he cried out. With the next pulse, he sat up and began to sing a bawdy, popular song. Another, slightly longer pulse still didn't produce a seizure, but the patient protested in perfectly clear Italian, "Che cazzo fai?" or "What the fuck are you doing?" Cerletti was pleased that the man's speech was no longer incoherent. One more attempt, and the patient cried out that another would be deadly. Now the doctors looked at each other nervously, fearful of proceeding. Cerletti nodded. Bini gave the pulse. And since the patient still did not have a full seizure, Cerletti ended the trial for that day, heartened that the patient was unharmed and speaking. So they tried again a few days later, and he woke up and he told them his name. His name was Enrico. He came from Milan, and he eventually was released from the hospital seemingly well. Mm-hmm. But then again, 2 years later, his wife wrote to doctors Bini and Cerletti and said that he had relapsed. He was schizophrenic, and they were relapsing. These are relapsing illnesses. And so anyway, this was the beginning of ECT as a sort of treatment that works quite well, especially for the kind of depression that I had. Yeah. So yes.
So you say further on in that chapter that shock treatment brought my own suicidal crisis under control. So you had maybe a beneficial experience?
I did. I had a beneficial experience. I was in very, 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 very terrible shape because my illness had been let to kind of go on too long because I had a baby who died. I mean, obviously people looked at me and said, she's grieving, she's very sad. It was difficult to tell what was happening, that I was actually falling into a very severe depressive illness. I didn't know really what depression was, nor did people in my family go to psychiatrists. So that's what it looked like. Mm-hmm. But it should have been, I should have seen someone sooner. 6 weeks earlier, 8 weeks earlier, and probably would have been on medication, which probably would have worked. And none of this would have ever needed to have happened. Mm-hmm. As it was, I did have to have quite a long series of shock treatments and became released from this depressive psychosis, this very severe state that I was in.
Hmm.
And then I was put on medication after that and released from the hospital.
So with that in mind, right, that you describe yourself as being released from this psychosis, do you think that there is a responsibility then, this is a slightly lighter question before moving into some audience ones, on popular culture, on how ECT and depression and these topics are presented? So we've got like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Frankenstein, much more recently Homeland, which slightly says in the scene, I don't know if you've seen it, but...
Has anybody seen the scene? It's at the end of the first season of Homeland, when Carrie has
this,
ECT.
has the ECT. But she tries to convince her mentor, I can't remember his name, that it has improved and developed. So if there was less stigma around it, would there be more research put into it, and could it develop faster and better and be of greater benefit? Well,
I think ECT is a very effective treatment. It's still used quite a lot for people with treatment-resistant depression, for bipolar depression. And I don't think that it needs more research necessarily, not ECT, but certainly other. There's a lot of work that's gone into the medications, but because there's been a great disappointment in neuroscience, an enormous amount of money has gone into various neuroscientific experiments to try and find the targets, the biological targets for these illnesses. But because the brain, not enough progress has been made in understanding the brain, which is apparently far too complex for even the brainiest neuroscientists in the world to figure out, there has been a definite disappointment there.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether an enormous amount of money has been poured into neuroscience, and now Big Pharma has essentially left the field of psychiatry because they couldn't come up with new ideas for medications. So now we have ketamine. There's new ketamine treatment, which is pretty new. That seems promising. And people are beginning to experiment or work on treatments with the psychedelics, which sounds like fun. I'll try that. Microdosing, et cetera. It's against the law in the United States, but people have written articles about getting access to these meds, and I mean meds, tiny doses of LSD and stuff. And the woman who's married to Michael Chabon, she's a novelist named Ayelet Waldman. She wrote a little book about microdosing. She has bipolar, and it's quite amusing.
Wow.
But unfortunately, it's against the law. So.
Okay, so far, at least.
So yes, I think that a lot of work has to be done, but it's really the big problem is that the brain is so complex, and it's the most complex thing anywhere. Yeah. I talk a little bit about my childhood in here, because of course, when you look back at your life, when you've had a lot of therapy, which you end up having when you have depression, you begin to see in your childhood, oh, I kind of think that I was depressed then when I was 8, or here when I was 12, or certainly when I was 16, and I stopped seeing all my friends, and I didn't go to the prom, or and you start to recognize it afterward, in the sort of looking back. But let me just read one passage about childhood, which you might find interesting, on 178. And I'm really happy to take questions on anything. All right. So I'm growing up in a little row house in Philadelphia. The houses on our street were built just after World War II, and the front entrance jutted out from the stone facade to create a stoop, and on the inside, a vestibule. The strange word vestibule rolled around in my mind when I passed through it. Directly ahead as you came through, the stairway led up to 3 bedrooms, and the living room was to the right. This part of our house sets the stage for a strong memory. I was walking down the stairs and about to go outside to play, when just as I was about to enter the vestibule, a wave of sadness passed through me. It was such an unfamiliar feeling that I can still recall it. It was like walking through a cold atmosphere or through a cloud bank. By the time I stepped out the front door into the sunshine, it had passed. Nothing that had just taken place had given me any reason to feel sad. I was so puzzled that I tried to make it happen again. I thought deliberately of the saddest things I could imagine: the death of my parents, my own death. I envisioned myself lying in a coffin, my family weeping. These thoughts brought tears to my eyes, but they didn't bring back that unsettling feeling. I was perhaps 7 or 8 at the time. That sensation returned once or twice while we still lived in that house. I've sometimes wondered whether it was the shadow of the depressive illness that was coming for me, or that was perhaps already present. There's one other thing that I think, in the context of the title of the talk, which has to do with loss and recovery and sort of learning to live with things, is that the death of my daughter, whom I only knew for 2 days because she died of a heart defect that she was born with, became, because of what happened in the aftermath of her death, kind of twined with this illness, with this trauma of being hospitalized and being suicidal. And so her death and her loss, and then because I got divorced a few years later and I didn't have another child for 13 years, and I thought I might never have another child, that loss was, in a sense, a part of feeling the pain of this, or the weight of it, for a really long time. So part of the book is also sort of learning or coming to terms with or processing the death of the baby through Freud's famous essay called Mourning and Melancholia. So that's, and sort of putting my daughter, finding a grave for her for her ashes when we got divorced, is another little piece of the book. So all I'm trying to say is the book is really about kind of learning to live with what surprises you along the path of your life, what comes your way that you are actually not prepared for, and that it will take you time to figure out how to survive and how to adapt to and how to sort of live with these vulnerabilities and be somehow learn to be resilient and learn to be stronger and learn to go on surviving.
When you ask yourself that question, like with this of the previous photo of yourself, did this girl know what misfortunes lay ahead of her? And you speak of with your first husband about when you came across the graveyard originally, and would you guys have ever known the misfortune that lay ahead of you? Do you ever feel that same fear now?
I feel that, I think, you know what happened, because this happened to me was I was in my 20s, and having been very fortunate up to that time, there's 6 children in my family. Nothing terrible had happened to any of us before this. So this quite terrible thing happened. And then I was in terrible shape. And it was very, very surprising. But I think that at that early stage in my life, I then felt that life was dangerous, unpredictable, or that I was very unlucky. Mm-hmm. I was born on Friday the 13th, by the way. And I thought, there you go. But this idea, I think that there's a certain kind of gravity that comes with this kind of experience, that you realize, yes, life is very precarious. And just because you're a white person and you have enough to eat and your father has a job and in the eyes of the world you look fairly lucky, mm-hmm. you don't know, there's a certain kind of randomness or contingency about life, and that's what I'm talking about. Okay. So in other words, I don't feel safe, but I do feel like I will try. I have experience now with just trying to get through things, a certain kind of. Yeah, I think so.
So first of all, very glad that you're here, and
I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, you're. I have a question about actually your suicide attempt itself. How you felt afterwards, like how quick did it take to regret it, and like to what extent did it set back your recovery? Or would it rather like give you a kick, like, oh my God, I want to recover?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I was very, very, very unhappy that I had attempted suicide in a very dramatic way. That's just not, it was quite melodramatic. But at the same time, if you read that part of the book, you'll see that I was in a condition that's called depressive psychosis, that in a sense, that was the act of a person who was not herself, like in a state of extreme suffering. I really needed to be finished. This had, I mean, so I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't live another day. So at the same time, I was very much regretful that that had happened, because now I had to live with the fact that I had attempted suicide and that I had marked myself. And when I was working on the book, I learned, when I looked up the word stigma, that in fact the word stigma is a mark, a scar, a mark of difference, the mark of Cain. I had actually stigmatized myself literally. So that's kind of funny. But yes, I really, really, really wished that it hadn't happened, because for a long time I was so ashamed of it, and now I feel like that was the act of a very suffering person who was not in control of herself, and so I have much more empathy for that person. Yeah.
Hi, I suppose I was
Hi.
just wondering, you spoke a little bit about on reflection, you identified maybe some signals as a child that maybe you sensed maybe were signals that you were kind of, maybe having those signals of depression, or is there anything, I suppose, that you recommend for us as people, how we can support either our own children or our friends around us if we identify signals, or that kids suggest that they feel sad, or like to actually kind of get ahead? Or
Yeah, I do think one of the things I learned recently is that in the States where I live, only 2 of the 50 United States actually mandate mental health education in high schools, which is astonishing, because I realized that I had this kind of depressive episode in high school when I was about 16 that I clearly recognize now as an episode. And had there been access to that knowledge, like what are the symptoms, I would have been able to recognize it myself. So I do think that as parents, one should know kind of what the symptoms are, and one should encourage one's children to talk about their feelings, because certainly I think in my generation, we didn't do that. And so I kept it all to myself. I was becoming a rather sensitive child, and thought I needed to manage this all by myself as the eldest girl in a large family. I didn't want to cause anybody any trouble. So, yeah. Other questions?
It's a good question. I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that one, because sometimes the responsibility is placed on the person with depression to speak up and to reach out. From somebody with your experience, can you give advice maybe to those of us who, when you're trying to help, and when you're trying to encourage somebody to speak up, or you're trying to encourage your friend to come out with you or to take a walk with you, but you're being met with a lot of resistance?
Yeah.
Is there any advice that you could give?
What you're pointing out is the fact that when people become depressed, they do become withdrawn. And I'll speak for myself. You do feel like you're like the world's most boring person. And no one would ever want to hang out with you because you have nothing to say. You kind of have no enthusiasm. And so people do tend to withdraw because they feel like they're just a bummer to be around. But it sounds like your instincts are to be kind and to sort of encourage someone. I think I would encourage people to just talk about how they're feeling and to say, I want to hang out with you. Let's go watch a movie. You can do something really easy, say, we don't have to talk, let's watch a movie together. But you just kind of present yourself as company, as a kind of presence there.
So to keep going, continue doing that.
You must not allow the person to become really isolated, because that's when things start to
deteriorate.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mary. A few more questions over there.
Hi, Mary. Thanks a lot for having a very open conversation
You're
about these
welcome.
topics. You earlier mentioned you dealing with melancholic depression, and also in the immediate aftermath after your suicide attempt, feeling shame and guilt. So many a times, speaking for myself, like the hardest part I find is not anchoring myself on my past self and making improvements on my mental health. Could you speak a bit about about the process or the line of thinking you employed to get out of that,
To get
that
out of
loop
it.
of, thinking about, looping on that and, getting out of that cycle and making improvements?
How did you make the progress
Aha.
out of that cycle?
And I think that what you might also be referring to is breaking away from a certain way of thinking about yourself.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Because you do
That
think of
aspect.
yourself as a loser, as a bore, as a person who's always, everything goes wrong for. I think that obviously having been in psychotherapy was enormously helpful. It helps to, as I say in the book, one of the reasons that I wrote the book that I wrote, which was to put my story into this longer story of all of these people who have been treated for mental illness and treated for depression. I realized that these are my community, in a sense, in my story. And it's an effort to not feel isolated and to not feel alone. So I think that when you're in therapy, or if you can get access to therapy with someone that you trust, you then feel like you have an ally and you're not alone. And you're not alone in the circle of your own thoughts, in that kind of downward spiral or that circling, that ruminating, where you just go round and round and you don't get anywhere. You need someone to sort of help you train yourself to say, I know that way of thinking isn't going to go anywhere good for me, and let me just put that aside and go take a walk or go get some exercise. Or there's a kind of training that you can do for yourself. And I think that mindfulness can also be very helpful in this way, where you begin to look at your thoughts and you say, this is not helping. And so you need to kind of be your own therapist if you don't have access to a therapist all the time. But I do think there are ways of doing this. Yeah, and I could recommend some books about this. Yeah, we could follow up.
Yeah, very great. And it's also important to recognize as well that it can sometimes take a while to find the right therapist.
Yeah, that can be very difficult.
They can be a great person and a great therapist, but not
Right.
a great therapist for you.
Right, exactly. And so it can be very slow and frustrating. But you must, realize that there's always, the way forward is always out there.
We're almost out of time. I have two closing questions. I want to talk a little bit about your empathy and your emotional vulnerability. And I'm going to start with a quote as well to give you guys some context. I couldn't help identifying with my mother. I couldn't help absorbing her emotional force field. So, in my opinion, that's a gift, that type of empathy and that attunement to what others are going through. But it's also potentially a burden.
Yeah, that's true.
Is it a gift you'd give up?
I don't think it's a gift I'd give up. I realized that as a child, I say this a little bit, I talk about my childhood and my family, the pressures my parents were under, and the way that kind of absorbed some responsibility, guilt, etc. as a Catholic child. Having very permeable boundaries or not sufficient boundaries, I think, is something that some of us have, and something that traditionally girls have had more, we're sort of socialized to be more open to the emotions of others and to absorb the household energy. At the same time, I know that was true of me as a child, but I think it's also the part of me that allowed me to become a literary scholar and to be very open to reading and literature and a way of kind of absorbing all of that emotion and information in the arts.
Yeah.
So I would not give that up because that's been a really beautifut part of my life.
Great. Lovely answer.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have so many more questions that I want to ask. I wanted to touch on Catholicism. I wanted to talk about your letter to your daughter. We're pretty much out of time. For my final question, in your last chapter, you say that you express the hope that writing the book would help you to come to terms with the experience. Has it?
It really has. I think that writing the book has been I guess when you think about, I don't think about myself as an artist by any means. I'm not a fiction writer. This is my first book. And I've been a teacher for a long time. But one of the things that people do when they create a work of art is to sort of externalize and give form to something that feels unexpressed or chaotic or sort of unprocessed. And certainly in that sense, this book has allowed me to do that. And I feel like I've turned it into something that has form and that's very clear and that has a structure and that is communicating something that I've always wanted to communicate. And so I'm happy about that.
That's great. We're happy about that. Thank you, Mary.
Thank
It has
you.
been a pleasure
Thank
speaking
you.
to you.
It's been a pleasure.